Picture a German position dug in somewhere along the Western Front in early 1945, watching a column of Sherman tanks roll into view. Every tank in that column looks the way a Sherman is supposed to look, except for one. Bolted above its turret is a strange steel frame packed with 60 tubes, stacked in rows like something torn off a fairground ride and welded onto a war machine. Nobody on the receiving end has seen anything like it before, and for a moment, that unfamiliarity buys it a strange kind of safety. The defenders don't know what they're looking at, so they don't know yet that it's the one vehicle in that column they should fear most. Then the launcher opens up. Not one single thunderclap, but a ripping staccato rhythm. One rocket leaving its tube roughly every half second. 60 rockets screaming out in sequence across something like 30 seconds. A rolling wave of explosions landing across the position rather than one instantaneous blow. It's still more high explosive arriving in less time than a single tank gun could ever manage, round for round. And soldiers who lived through barrages from conventional artillery, without flinching, remembered this as something different. The sound of it, especially, stuck with the men who survived it. Most people who know their World War II armor can describe a Sherman tank without thinking twice. The silhouette is burned into popular memory by decades of films and museum displays. Almost nobody's ever heard of the version that carried a rocket organ on its back, named after a steam Calliope, because that's exactly what the tube array looked like. And almost nobody knows that once German troops learned to recognize one, they stopped treating it like just another tank in the column. By 1944, American armored and infantry units pushing through Normandy's hedgerows and toward Germany's fortified defensive lines kept running into the same tactical problem. A single Sherman 75mm main gun could destroy a bunker or a strong point with a direct hit, but it fired one round at a time, and a well-dug-in defensive position often needed more than a single accurate shot to break. It needed enough firepower landing close together in time to suppress every defender in the position at once, buying infantry the seconds they needed to close the distance and finish the job. American artillery wasn't slow or incapable. It was, by 1944, some of the best coordinated fire support of the war. But it lived behind the advancing line, tied to observers, communication, and a battery that had to be found, requested, and laid onto a target before it could fire. And in fast-moving contact, those minutes mattered. What armored units actually needed wasn't proof that artillery had failed them. It was something that could ride with the column itself and put a battery's worth of simultaneous explosive power onto a target the instant it was spotted, without waiting on anyone in the rear. A tank gun was precise, but limited to one shot at a time, walking fire onto a target through repeated attempts, while the position shot back in between. Artillery could deliver the volume, but not always the immediacy. In the hedgerow country of Normandy especially, where a defended position might be 100 yards away and out of sight again in seconds, the gap between spotting a target and putting an artillery battery onto it could matter more than the raw firepower on either end of the equation. Whether trading away a Sherman's normal fighting ability for that immediacy was actually worth it was a question American crews would spend the rest of the war arguing about. But the appeal, on paper, was obvious enough. Army engineer Victor Hawkins had an answer by 1943, and it was about as direct as a solution could get. Bolt a rocket artillery battery straight onto the top of a Sherman tank. The result, designated the T34 and nicknamed Calliope, after the steam-powered pipe organ that had once provided the soundtrack for Mississippi riverboats and traveling circuses, mounted 60 launch tubes in a frame anchored to the sides of a standard Sherman's turret. 36 tubes in a fixed upper bank, 24 more in a lower bank designed to be jettisoned. Each tube fired a 4.5-inch M8 rocket carrying roughly the same explosive punch as a standard howitzer shell, out to a maximum range a little beyond 2 miles. The whole rack traversed and elevated right along with the turret and main gun, since its arm was physically clamped to the barrel. And the array was ripple-fired. One rocket loosed roughly every half second to keep the rockets from interfering with each other in flight, so that all 60 could be emptied in around 30 seconds, a volume of fire that would ordinarily have taken a coordinated battery of field guns to match, delivered instead by a single vehicle already moving with the advance. Later production runs swapped in a few added tubes and heavier rockets, but the core idea across every version stayed the same. Turn one Sherman into a rolling rocket battery for as long as it needed to be one. Because it rode on a Sherman chassis the Army was already building and fielding by the thousands, the Calliope didn't require inventing an entirely new armored vehicle from scratch, though it was never quite as simple as bolting rockets onto tanks the Army already had lying around. Every launcher still meant specialized rocket ammunition, an added electrical firing system, extra loading procedures, and extra training and maintenance on top of what a standard Sherman crew already handled. And the Army never had enough specialists trained on the equipment to keep it running smoothly wherever it went. The design's biggest limitation was baked in from the start. With the launcher frame mounted directly above the turret and its elevation arm physically clamped to the barrel of the 75mm gun, the Sherman's main armament couldn't be fired at all while the Calliope was attached, turning what should have been a fully capable tank into a rocket artillery vehicle first and a gun tank not at all for as long as the launcher stayed mounted. Reloading it once it was empty wasn't something the crew could do from inside the turret either. Someone had to climb up and reconnect each rocket's electrical firing lead by hand, tube by tube, usually with help from nearby infantry, which meant a spent Calliope sitting in the open for as long as that reload took. Engineers fitted a hydraulic release that let a crew jettison the entire launcher assembly in seconds, dropping it clear so the Sherman could go straight back to being a standard fighting vehicle the moment its rockets were spent or a more urgent threat, like enemy armor, demanded the main gun instead. In practice, crews in the field found the release didn't always cooperate when they needed it to, which meant a tank that couldn't shed its launcher fast enough sometimes had to fight the rest of an engagement as a rocket truck with no main gun at all. The Calliope's actual combat record was more limited than its dramatic silhouette suggested, and part of the reason traces back to timing. Most of the launchers had been manufactured before D-Day, with an eye toward bunker busting on the Normandy beaches themselves. But the plan was dropped before the invasion. The launcher's height gave the tank a high center of gravity that made it unstable to transport, a risk nobody wanted to gamble on an operation where landing craft needed to unload cleanly under fire. By the time the weapon reached meaningful combat use, it had missed the invasion it was first built for entirely. That didn't mean it sat unused forever. In December 1944, 30 Shermans of the 743rd Tank Battalion had Calliope launchers installed specifically to support a planned push by the 30th Infantry Division, only for Germany's surprise Ardennes offensive, the opening of the Battle of the Bulge, to scrap those plans and send the launchers back into storage before they fired a shot in that operation. The launchers didn't come out of storage again until February 1945, once Patton's Third Army had a use for them. In March, as that army pushed through the Saarland region of western Germany, Calliope-equipped Shermans finally got the kind of combat use they'd been designed for, backing infantry and armor as they worked through fortified German ground. Through early 1945 more broadly, Calliope-equipped Shermans saw scattered, experimental use with the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 12th, and 14th Armored Divisions, and with several separate tank battalions, generally in the same breakthrough support role, softening fortified positions and suppressing defenders just ahead of an advance. One documented account from a Calliope crew makes clear just how quickly the enemy learned to recognize what they were looking at. Tank Commander Glenn "Cowboy" Lamb of the 714th Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, recalled that Calliope-equipped tanks were treated as prize targets by German gunners, who let a column of ordinary Shermans pass unmolested down a road before opening up on the one Calliope in the formation with a 20mm anti-aircraft gun. One of the tank's crewmen was killed in the engagement. It's a grim but telling detail. At least one American crew remembered German gunners singling their Calliope out for the kind of specific, concentrated attention no ordinary Sherman in that same column ever drew on its own. The Army's own post-war evaluation of the weapon, however, was far less flattering than that anecdote alone suggests. Crews reported frequent misfires, dispersion that was often wider and less predictable than hoped, and a jettison system that didn't reliably work when it mattered. And the assessment generally judged that conventional artillery and mortars could produce comparable results without sidelining a tank's main gun to get them. What made the Calliope worth mounting at all wasn't precision. 60 unguided rockets fired in rapid succession scattered across a wide area instead of landing with anything close to a single artillery shell's accuracy. And the weapon's own evaluators were honest about that shortfall. What it delivered instead was noise and simultaneity, the shriek of dozens of rockets launching in close succession, followed by that many explosions landing across a position within a matter of seconds, was the kind of thing accounts from the period describe as mentally rattling to defenders in a way that outran its actual physical damage. That lines up with how the US Army generally talked about massed rocket fire in this period. Hard to aim precisely, but genuinely unsettling to be on the receiving end of, in a way that didn't always require a direct hit to have an effect. That's a real, documented characteristic of the weapon. Not a guarantee that every German position facing a Calliope broke and ran, which the record doesn't actually support, but a consistent thread in how both American planners and the men who used it described its value. It was engineered less around the certainty of a kill with any single rocket, and more around the idea that a defender who survived the barrage would, for a little while at least, not be in much shape to keep fighting effectively. That's also why the Calliope's reputation and its combat record can look like they belong to two different weapons. Judged purely by confirmed kills or destroyed positions, the assessments were modest, sometimes openly disappointing. Judged by what it did to a defender's willingness to keep his head up during those 30 seconds of rockets landing, it did something a single tank round, however accurate, could never manage. Both things were true about the same weapon at the same time, which is part of why crews who used it kept mixed opinions about it even as the war went on. The Calliope was never going to become a mainstay of the post-war armored force, and the same practical compromises that made it useful in 1944 and 1945 also capped how far it could ever go. The main gun stayed dead until the launcher was jettisoned, and the release for doing that didn't always work when crews needed it to. The added height and weight hurt the tank's stability in exactly the way that had already cost it a roll at Normandy. And underneath all of it sat the Army's own post-war verdict. Conventional artillery and mortars usually did the job just as well, without asking a Sherman crew to give up their main gun to get there. There was a technical fix in the pipeline, but it arrived too late to matter. In 1945, a new spin-stabilized rocket, the M16, replaced the older fin-stabilized M8 the Calliope had been designed around, trading the fins for a spin that came from angled nozzles at the base, closer to how a rifle bullet flies, and delivering meaningfully tighter groupings. But the M16 wasn't simply a better round for the same old launcher. It belonged to a new generation of rocket equipment, including a 60-tube ground launcher nicknamed the Hornet's Nest, built as the Calliope's replacement rather than an upgrade to it. By the time any of that reached the field in numbers, the war in Europe was already ending, and the weapon built to solve 1944's tactical problem never got the chance to mature much past the improvised, jury-rigged answer it had always been. Relatively few Shermans ever received the conversion, and most of those that did spent more time in storage or reserve than in combat, waiting for the breakthrough missions the weapon had been designed for, instead of seeing the continuous frontline use an ordinary gun tank got. Unlike the Sherman itself, which rolled off assembly lines by the tens of thousands and fought on every front of the war, the Calliope never had that kind of institutional investment behind it. It was a wartime expedient from the start, built to close one tactical gap and nothing more. And once the war that opened that gap ended, there was no standing requirement urgent enough to carry a rocket organ bolted onto a tank turret into the post-war force. The Calliope never earned the lasting fame of the tank it rode on. Ask someone to picture a Sherman, and they'll see the standard silhouette everyone recognizes from newsreels and museum floors. Not the strange, tube-studded variant that briefly rolled through Germany screaming rockets at fortified positions. It shows up in detailed unit histories and the personal accounts of the men who crewed it. But it stayed out of the broader public memory the standard gun tank claimed for itself, overshadowed by equipment that fought on every front instead of a handful of operations late in the war. Even among people who can name half a dozen Sherman variants without hesitation, the Calliope tends to be the one they've heard mentioned in passing, rather than the one they can actually describe. Part of that is simple math. Thousands of standard Shermans fought from North Africa to the Pacific, across the entire length of the war, and every one of them left behind photographs, after-action reports, and veterans who talked about them for the rest of their lives. A handful of Calliopes fought for a few months in one theater, in a role narrow enough that most soldiers who served in World War II never crossed paths with one at all. It didn't get sidelined because it failed outright. It got sidelined because the problem it was made to solve stopped existing the moment the war in Europe ended. That's the real story behind the T34 Calliope. It wasn't a wonder weapon, and the men who made or crewed it never claimed it was. A blunt, improvised answer to one problem, how to give an advancing tank column a battery's worth of simultaneous firepower, bolted onto a tank that was already winning the war on its own merits. Precision was never the point. What mattered was being loud and sudden enough to unsettle whoever was on the receiving end in that first instant of firing. And by every honest account from the men who used it, that's exactly the job it did. A weapon remembered less for what it destroyed than for the sound it made in the seconds before anyone on the ground understood what was actually happening to them. If you want more stories about the strangest, most overlooked hybrids that quietly did real work on the battlefields of World War II, subscribe to Warfare Unclassified. And let us know in the comments which forgotten piece of wartime engineering you want us to dig up next.